So welcome to this fourth session on the Heart Sutra. So we're going to start as usual with the recitation of the Heart Sutra. Um, let's go ahead and begin with that. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Massa Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared: Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. Let's just recite the refuge verse together if you know it. If not, you can just listen to the words in English when I recite it the first time, and then I'll recite it 2 more times in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanamgi Drola Penchir Sangye Drupar Sho. Okay, let's do just a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to settle the mind a bit, to let go of whatever distractions we might have currently, preoccupations, worries, whatever. So again, you all probably know some technique to work with the breath. So if you have a technique you prefer, then by all means you can use that for the next few minutes. And if not, then I'll just suggest, as I usually do, tuning into the sensation towards the tip of the nose where you feel the air coming in and out of the nostrils, making that your meditation object, or whatever way you're making the breath your meditation object. Just try to stay present with the breath. Try not to let the mind get distracted, but when the mind does get distracted, and you see that that's occurred, to simply let that distraction go and return to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in setting your motivation for this session. So now let's set our motivation. As we saw in an earlier class, there are these three types of wisdom that we're trying to accumulate on the path. It really constitute what we mean by that wisdom component of the path. Can generally say that there are two elements of the path, just like the two wings of a bird that allow the bird to fly. We need both of these components in order to accomplish complete enlightenment. And wisdom is one, but the other is this compassionate method. The kind of more emotive quality that helps us to continue to do all of the work to develop this wisdom. So whether we're talking about what we're doing here, in these classes, which is to develop the wisdom that arises from hearing, investigating the teachings, through listening to teachings, as well as to reading, all of these ways that we, are able to gain some knowledge. This first level of wisdom is very important because this is how information begins to develop in our minds, how correct knowledge begins to form to help us to move away from the mistaken ideas that we've had about this world, about ourselves, about life in general. But then we need to cultivate a wisdom that arises from our thinking about the teachings, reflecting. This is also quite important because if we leave the teachings only on the surface in terms of things we've heard, but we haven't investigated, then we don't generate a deeper conviction in those teachings. And the real goal, what we are working towards, is to generate the wisdom that arises from our meditation, which really only occurs when the mind is very deeply focused, when we have calm abiding and special insight, these two that are united, the ability for the mind to remain very stable and to also penetrate very deeply into the nature of things. And in these teachings on emptiness, this is the goal. But we have to start where we are and recognize that for most of us, we're simply trying to accumulate that wisdom. So while these teachings are very much pertaining to the wisdom wing, to that component of our practice, we have to unite it with this compassionate motivation, in particular the motivation of bodhicitta. Otherwise, the work we do won't bring forth that full result. We can generate some awareness of emptiness, we can generate some knowledge, but that won't become the cause for enlightenment until we generate the mind of bodhicitta together with those activities. So now cultivate this aspiration that has two aspects. As I always mention, the main aspect, Lama Zopa emphasizes this, the main, most important thing behind bodhicitta is to be able to benefit all sentient beings. To recognize that this is why we are primarily here, is that all our efforts, the development of these various levels of wisdom, all of this is intended to benefit others. But the way that we are most capable at benefiting others isn't in our current state, because we know how difficult it is even to help one person to have some greater understanding of the nature of reality and so on. So we have to develop our abilities so much more. We have to actually become enlightened ourselves before we can lead others to that state most skillfully. So if we are to enact the ultimate welfare of all beings by leading them to enlightenment, we have to become a Buddha. Each one of us have to achieve that state. So try to unite this thought of focusing on the wisdom teachings of the Buddha, as we're going to be doing today, with that aspiration to become enlightened for the sake of all sentient beings, to then be fully qualified, endowed with all the perfect wisdom and compassion, as well as the perfect power and ability, the skillful means to be able to lead all sentient beings to that state of complete enlightenment. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So in the last class, we did go through, got into the beginning of this, how Avalokiteshvara answered the question that Shariputra posed. So let's go ahead and do the screen share, and I'll just go through a few slides before we get started, just to get us back in the ballpark of what we were doing. And let me do the slideshow from here. Whoops, somehow I ended up back there. I want to go up a bit there. Okay. So again, this is our fourth class. Let's go ahead and do this praise together that was in our text by Tendar Larampa. They say it's recited before the Heart Sutra, but we're going to recite it after. That's okay. But just this little praise that talks about the perfection of wisdom and so on. I bow down to the mother of the conquerors of the three times, the perfection of wisdom, inexpressible by words or thoughts, which is unproduced and unceased, like the entity of the sky, the object of the wisdom of unique knowledge. So I found it kind of interesting, this phrase inexpressible by words or thoughts. One student that was in the transcripts from the commentary by Geshe Tempel asked him, well, if it's inexpressible by words or thoughts, why are we spending so many, you know, hours studying it, and why are there so many words written about it? Well, it's because we can't express what it's like to get to that ultimate realization, to get to that final wisdom that's realizing emptiness in that meditative state. But we can know what emptiness is through doing our own investigation. Again, we kind of move away from our wrong understanding slowly by first beginning to doubt how things exist, and then eventually coming to a correct assumption about how they exist in terms of emptiness, and then finally coming to some real inferential knowledge about that through our own reasoning, and then eventually having that direct realization where we will know emptiness in that most pure form that is inexpressible. But essentially, this is kind of what goes on. So this is why, even though it is inexpressible, we need to study this. So again, this part of the text that is kind of the discussion of the actual sutra that is produced from the meditative equipoise of the Buddha, where he kind of, through the power of the Buddha, he gets Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara to engage in this dialogue. There's the three parts: how Shariputra asked his question, which we covered last time, and I'm not going to go back into that. How Avalokiteshvara answered the question in terms of how any son or daughter of the noble lineage should practice the profound perfection of wisdom. This is what we're in now, and then, of course, how that was admired by the Buddha. So last time we did introduce this concept. And one thing I do want to say before we go too far on that idea of son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage is to say what we are talking about there when we say the lineage. I didn't really explain this last week, I don't believe, is we're talking about somebody in whom the Mahayana lineage has been awakened, meaning that there are those who are perhaps destined for the Hinayana vehicle. Remember how we talked about there are three pathways. You have the hearers, the solitary realizers, and the bodhisattvas. Well, the hearers and the solitary realizers, these are beings who can't bear more than the burden of their own individual liberation. And it's still a very noble goal to aim for one's own liberation. It's one less being that is suffering in samsara when they attain the culmination of their path, the state of arhat, or foe destroyer. But nonetheless, they aren't of the noble lineage. They aren't of the lineage of the Mahayana, of those who want to become bodhisattvas, or who are bodhisattvas, who are aiming to achieve full enlightenment. So this is kind of who is being spoken to. Remember how I mentioned, son or daughter refers to the fact that you have men or women can do this, and they say generally those who are more indefinite in their gender don't have a stable basis for that. But nonetheless, any man or woman, son or daughter of the noble lineage who is aspiring towards enlightenment, this is exactly how they should practice in terms of seeing that form is empty and so on, all the things that we're going to go into. So the first little introductory part again just simply said, Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly, beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. So I went through the five aggregates last time. They're on your screen right now. And these are a way that the Buddha parsed up a sentient being in terms of the basis for that sentient being. That sentient being generally has form, other than in the formless realm where they don't have gross form at all. And then feeling, discrimination, two of the mental factors, compositional factors, which includes all the other mental factors, all these other components of our mind, functional components of our mind, and then consciousness itself, which is the mind in that most kind of larger bucket in terms of uh, the sphere in which all of this is happening. So we can essentially divide it into form, being the physical component of our being, and second through fifth, feeling through consciousness, being the mental component. So you could say there are two main components of our being that is the basis for a sentient being. It's physical and mental kind of components or basis, parts, aggregates, heaps, because all four of the last ones of these do fall into that mental aggregate. So then let's take the screen off for just a second and go and look at this, what Shariputra or what Avalokiteshvara says after this. And I think we just started to talk about this. Things you might have in front of you, by the way, I usually mention that at the beginning of the session. I didn't do that yet. You can certainly have the sutra, continue to have that handy. The commentary, which we've been using, which once more is called Commentary on the Heart Sutra, Jewel Light Illuminating the Meaning. And here we're on page 13. That's where this section is. And then you might also have the nice little colored chart, the one that has all the little colored boxes that shows how this is all divided up. And I'll get into the divisions in terms of these 5 paths shortly. So those are the main things you should have in front of you. One other thing that you might have when we do start talking about the paths is a chart that I distributed, get to Maria, sent out to everyone. That's called the the Mahayana path, according to Prasangika Madhyamaka, I think is what it's called. Mahayana path Prasangika Madhyamaka. I'm going to also share that on my screen. If I am able to do that, I should be able to do that when we get to that. So let's go to the commentary and talk about what was said already that we looked at last time regarding the second topic, how Avalokiteshvara answered. The short answer, this is page 13 again, the short answer is from Avalokiteshvara said this, should view things in this way. So that's on your colored chart, that's that little part, that's the very beginning of the green box there, where it says should correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. This is kind of the very brief presentation of how the Bodhisattva should practice on the, or one inclined towards the Mahayana should practice the profound perfection of wisdom. Everything else that follows, is kind of an exposition of what that means. If we say, yeah, beholding those 5 aggregates also as an empty of inherent nature, well, what does that mean? What are we talking about? What are the various things that we need to investigate? And once more, recall that when also was used there, as it says, is to explain that it's not just the I, the person, this that is being investigated, which they say you investigate initially to determine emptiness, to perceive emptiness, but also everything other than the person, all the other phenomena that exist other than the person. All of these are empty of inherent existence. So this is how Avalokiteshvara is telling Shariputra that those inclined towards the lineage should be practicing, is to see everything as empty of inherent existence. So to start with the selflessness of persons, as we said, and then to go on to see the selflessness of phenomena. In fact, they say that if, again, you have the proper object of negation, remember how we talked about that word, how there's something we want to negate, which is this inherent existence of the person. If you have that identified properly, then the inherent existence of a person is the same as the inherent existence of a body, or the inherent existence of a chair, or the inherent existence of any phenomenon. So when we negate that inherent existence, we are also dealing with the same emptiness. The emptiness of a computer is the same as the emptiness of a person. It's just that it's a different basis for that, a different phenomenon that is being investigated to determine that emptiness. So this is pretty much what was said. Again, we're in the extensive answer now. That's the first part for ordinary beings. And then as we see when we get to the end on the second side, there's more sharp facultied practitioners who can get this right from the beginning based on the mantra. Those who have really sharp faculties, all they need to do is hear the mantra, and they're able to almost immediately discern this. So I do want to introduce these 5 paths, which I'm not sure I've spoken of earlier, and I want to do that through using this little chart that you may have again in front of you. It's the chart that says Mahayana Path, Prasangika Madhyamaka. I'm going to put it on the screen, and hopefully this will work. Like I said, what I need to do is just do a full screen read mode, and then it should be appearing there for you. This chart is got a lot of information on it that I don't feel I need to go into all of it, because otherwise it'll be overwhelming. It's too much terminology and too many other things. But essentially what I want to focus on is kind of right here where, I don't know if you can see the little where my cursor is. There's the what are called the path of accumulation, path of preparation, path of seeing, path of meditation, and then over on the other side, the path of no more learning. The path of no more learning is essentially Buddhahood. So this whole, movement from path of accumulation through the path of no more learning is how the Bodhisattva proceeds. And what I want to talk about in particular is kind of what is the demarcation of moving along those lines. Because this is sort of like if someone were to say you, well, in our school system, children start off with kindergarten or preschool, and then they go on to kindergarten, then they go on to grade school, and then they go on to middle school or whatever in high school, and then to university. You want to be able to show, well, what are the demarcations between those? I mean, when would one graduate from one level and go on to the next level? And I want to talk about them particularly in regard to the wisdom realizing emptiness. So the very kind of entry point into this, how one even gets on the path of accumulation and essentially becomes a bodhisattva, is through having bodhicitta. And not just bodhicitta in terms of a passing thought or something you can meditate, with some strength on your cushion. It means having what we call spontaneous bodhicitta or uncontrived bodhicitta. So this means through the force of your meditation, having developed your mind with great familiarity towards bodhicitta, it arises naturally. As you know, there are many techniques to develop, or a number of techniques to develop bodhicitta. Having used those repeatedly, one naturally has this desire to benefit others in that way. And so anytime one sees a sentient being, one naturally feels, I must become enlightened for this being. You don't have to think about all the causes that lead to that. So that's what gets you on the path of accumulation. So you don't necessarily have to have any wisdom realizing emptiness at all going into the path. Nonetheless, those of sharp faculties generally have some awareness of emptiness because they don't want to pursue a goal that they don't know is actually achievable. Well, how do you achieve the goal of Buddhahood? Again, through those two wings of compassion and wisdom. But if you look at the wisdom side and you say, well, I don't think you can actually get that wisdom because emptiness doesn't exist or whatever. If you come to that conclusion, then you're not going to engage in the whole path because you have to know that there's some reliability of the wisdom realizing emptiness. So a lot of our own investigation ahead of time is to help us have that conviction that what the Buddha says in terms of the wisdom that will propel us through these stages of development, that it actually exists, that it makes sense, that it is something that's grounded in reason, that we can investigate on our own. So this is kind of the idea behind this, is that those of sharper faculties, which I guess to some degree, if you're listening to this, you have some desire to sharpen your faculties and be able to perceive emptiness before making that commitment of bodhicitta, that you actually will have that prior to entering the path. You will already have some wisdom that has arisen at least from hearing, of course, and then from thinking, reflecting. You may not have it in terms of the wisdom arisen from meditation yet. Those three that I spoke about in the meditation today. So the path of accumulation. Path of accumulation is where you are. Sometimes Lama Zopa now calls this the path of merit because he likes to refer to both of these as merit, the merit of compassion or virtue and the merit of wisdom. But the idea is that you're trying to build those two, accumulate those, build a storehouse of merit in terms of your pursuing teachings on the Dharma, especially on emptiness, and then also accumulating the positive potential that comes when you engage in compassionate action towards others and so on. These both acting in tandem to help fuel you to the threshold where you finally cross over and enter the path of preparation. The path of preparation is called that because it's preparing you to have a direct realization of emptiness. You enter into the path of preparation. There's even a little demarcation on your chart. It's the little circle 4 there. When you look at circle 4 under the milestones, it says it's a union of calm abiding and special insight, observing emptiness. So this is this very focused mind, like I mentioned, of calm abiding, together with the special insight, observing emptiness, that it's still conceptual. It's still not a direct realization, but it's a very powerful mind that helps you cross over that threshold to become a bodhisattva on the path of preparation. Of course, you have to have the requisite merit of the compassionate, action, virtue, and so on to get there. But when you've achieved both of those, then you can cross over into the path of preparation. You notice there are 4 levels of the path of preparation, the heat, peak, forbearance, and what's called SMQ, which is a shorthand for supreme mundane qualities, which essentially means that that's the highest level of mundane or worldly qualities before you become an Arya, before you actually enter into kind of another dimension of being. You're no longer an ordinary being at that point. You are a superior or an Arya because you've had a direct insight into emptiness. back on these four levels, what's happening on each of them is that you're increasing your understanding of emptiness and your meditation on emptiness, where you eventually have it very fine-tuned at the supreme mundane qualities level, that fourth level, and the sense of subject and object are very, very slight. You're meditating on emptiness, but the veil is getting very, very thin. And eventually, that veil falls away completely. There's no conceptual mind present, and there is a direct realization of emptiness. And they say this is like comparable to when water is poured into water. You can't distinguish water from water once it's poured into the other water. Instead, it all blends as one. Your mind and emptiness, the object that you're realizing, become as one. And you have this meditative equipoise, it's called, on emptiness that helps you to remove the what are called the acquired obstructions that are afflicted. And anyway, I'm not going to go into a whole description of all of those, but because they're like these little herringbone things that are happening on each of these, from the path of seeing all the way through the path of meditation, each of the individual grounds. They are a meditative equipoise where you remove a respective part of your obstructions, and you become completely free from those in what's called the liberated path. The first part being the uninterrupted path, and then the liberated path. They say this is like if you had a thief in the house. The uninterrupted path is putting the thief outside the door, and then the liberated path is closing the door so that they will never come back again. So this is a process that we go through repeatedly, once on the path of seeing, and then a number of times on the path of meditation to continue through the remaining grounds. So once you've had your initial direct realization of emptiness, you come up out of that meditative equipoise and you have what's called subsequent attainment. That's kind of taking place on the rest of the path of seeing after you've had your initial seeing of emptiness in that direct way. And during that time, you're accumulating more merit. You're doing all the, bodhisattva deeds, and you're sharpening your ability to then sit in meditation again at some point that will act as the antidote to the first level of the innate obstructions that are afflicted, or obstructions to liberation. That will continue through the path of meditation. Now you have entered into the path of meditation when you come out of that with that liberated path, that path of release. When you are on that, you are then on the second ground of the path of meditation. And then you continue on the path of meditation all the way through the 10th ground. There is a demarcation that's the circle number 8, where at that point you have essentially attained liberation, meaning that you have removed all of the afflictive obstructions, all of those that are kind of our ignorance, that holds to things as inherently existent, all of our other afflictions, all that gets removed. But you still have to remove very subtle imprints. These subtle imprints are called the knowledge obstructions, or the obstructions to omniscience. These are very subtle imprints in our mind that come from our ignorance, that cause things to exist, or to appear to exist, from their own side. So I'll explain this a little bit more in a few minutes when we talk about realizing emptiness and the difficulty that we have with that and how things actually exist. This is what I want to spend today on, and we'll go back into the text to help us to do that. But you have these final grounds that are on the path of meditation that are called the pure grounds there. You see them as circle C under path of meditation. On B, you were removing all the afflictive obscurations that are innate within us. And then on C, you're removing all of the knowledge obscurations, the obscurations to omniscience. That's what keeps you from becoming a Buddha. And you remove those gradually over 3 levels, the 8th, ninth, and 10th grounds, these pure grounds. They're pure because you've already removed the afflictions. And eventually you remove them in your final meditation, which is said to be like a Vajra-like meditation. This meditation where you go into your meditation on emptiness, and when you come out, or as soon as you achieve the path of release, as soon as you've had an antidote, uh, kind of effectively getting rid of the final level of obscuration, you become a Buddha. At that point, you're on the path of no more learning, the 5th of these paths. So why I introduce those is simply so that you have some idea. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all the information on here because it's more than what you need. But this is a nice little chart that shows how the bodhisattva progresses. You go from left to right, moving from the path of accumulation all the way through to the path of no more learning. So the wisdom realizing emptiness initially starts out as that which is there through hearing and thinking, that first two of the three wisdoms on the path of accumulation. Once you enter the path of preparation, because you've had that union of calm abiding and special insight, those two together, you now have a wisdom arisen from meditation. But you haven't yet developed the deeper wisdom arisen from meditation, which is your direct realization. That happens when you enter the path of seeing. And then from there, through the path of meditation, all the way up to the path of no more learning, you continue to use that direct realization of emptiness as a tool to remove more and more of what's obscuring our minds, more and more of what's keeping us from becoming a Buddha. And then eventually, when you've removed the last bit, you cross that threshold and become a Buddha superior, an Arya Buddha, a being who has no more learning to do, no more work to do, because you've done all the work, you've removed everything. So again, I was covering up, I think, I don't know if it was covering up on yours or not, the little chart, the part of it with the afflictive obscurations and knowledge obscurations and so on. But essentially, yeah, this is um, what's going on here. Let me get out of that, do a stop share, and maybe open it up at this point to see if there are any questions before we go back to the text.
Don, those 10 paths are the 10 bhumis?
The 10 grounds are the 10 bhumis, yes.
Oh.
The bhumi is the Sanskrit word for ground.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you hear the 10 bhumis or on the 10th bhumi or whatever, or first bhumi, bodhisattva, that means wherever they're indicated on that chart. Yeah.
Okay.
Good question. Yeah, I forget that that's often the case, that people hear of it as bhumi. Yeah.
Right.
Any other questions or comments? Was it somewhat clear in terms of this progress? Okay, so when we go back to the text, especially this colored chart again, you'll see that on the colored chart there were little boxes off to the side that indicate what the teachings are pertaining to in terms of the bodhisattva's development. They kind of give some information to help inform what the bodhisattva would be meditating on at that level, or kind of some even perhaps what they're realizing. So the first one that we see, of course, is this wonderful thing that the Heart Sutra is known for, which is form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. And then goes on. Those are, again, the paths of accumulation and preparation. As I said, that's mostly the wisdom that arises from hearing or listening to the teachings, reading, and so on. And then the wisdom that arises from reflection. So that's where that is set out. And there are differences in terms of some other authors of commentary on this text might indicate them slightly different. This is what our author, Tendar Larampa, says, is at the next line or section where it says, Shariputra, likewise all phenomena are emptiness. There are kind of eight things that are set out here. They're emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Those eight things are said to be characteristics of the bodhisattva on the path of seeing when they're having their direct realization of emptiness. From there till pretty much close to the end is all about the path of meditation, when one is realizing the vast, I mean, you don't have to realize emptiness over again in terms of it's the same object you're realizing in regard to all phenomena, but you can now apply it in a wide way to everything that exists, and we'll go into all of those. The path of meditation continues to the next side, all the way up to where it says, the mind without obscuration and without fear, having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana, kind of showing that eventually through the force of the path of meditation, one arrives at the path of no more learning. One arrives at that place of Buddhahood where they've completely passed beyond error. They have no error in their mind whatsoever, no problems, no faults, and they attain that state. And then, of course, there's a little precept for practice that occurs there to tell us, how to achieve all of that, having gone through the various thoughts that inform the different levels of the path, the 5 paths. Then there's the mantra after it. So that's kind of where we're headed in terms of right now, this section we're going to begin with. So when we talk about this in terms of form is empty, this is where, Avalokiteshvara is starting with form for a good reason, and that's because Form is perhaps the most visible way we have of identifying ourselves as well as identifying other people, right? Like if you see on Facebook somebody's posted a picture and you go, "Oh, there I am." Well, you're not looking at your mind and all the mental components, those other four aggregates. You're usually seeing your form. We identify really strongly with our form. And so he's choosing that one as the beginning one to look at. But as he says at the very end, of that section, um, should, in the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. They're all empty in the same way. He's just going to begin with form, and he could have inserted in here, feeling is empty. Emptiness is feeling. Emptiness is not other than feeling, and so on. He could have done that for all five aggregates, but nonetheless, he uses shorthand and just says, yeah, and you could say the same thing for all of these. So let's talk a little bit about emptiness before we go back to the sutra, because it is important to spend a little time going through what we mean by emptiness. I did introduce this in terms of when I talked about the various forms of selflessness or emptiness that are taught in the different schools. But we're just going to focus on, this one for Prasangika. Chittamatra, or mind only, does come up in our commentary, so I will talk about that then. But what Prasangika is saying, this consequence middle way school, what they're saying is that everything that exists, in fact, any form, any consciousness, any phenomenon whatsoever, even emptiness itself, that it doesn't exist being established from its own side or by way of its own characteristics. Lama Zopa often uses the term that it doesn't exist as a real object, a real form. What he means by that, though, isn't that there is no reality when we negate that, but rather that the way that things exist is really, really very slight. There's there's just the very minimal amount needed for existence. And how we often understand emptiness quite clearly is by looking at the reasoning of dependent arising. So what I thought I'd do today is something I do sometimes when I teach on dependent arising, which is to use my little prop here, which I think you can see. I don't know if some of you have seen this before in terms of my presentation, but hopefully it'll be of some benefit. So everyone can see that what I'm holding in my hand is a clothespin, right? We identify this. Of course, when I held it in a group of people recently that had someone from England. They said, no, it's a closed peg. But anyway, it's got different names in different languages. In Spanish, it would be something. When I was in Latvia, it was called something else. When I was in Russia, it had a different name. But we know this is something that you use to put on a clothesline to hold your clothes while they dry. This has that function. So we're going to use this as a basis to explore dependent arising and come to see how the clothespin exists in a conventional way so we can understand how it doesn't exist in a more ultimate way. So the first level of dependent arising is the dependence upon causes and conditions. So let's think about the causes and conditions involved in this clothespin arising. This clothespin came into existence on the basis of a couple of primary causes, right? Because we have the wooden parts of the clothes peg, these two kind of pegs, and then we have the spring that's involved in the clothespin that allows it to close down. Well, the spring is made out of metal, so we would say that there's definitely metal as a cause for this, and of course everything involved in producing the metal, in terms of mining the metal and what produced the metal in the earth from all the geological processes that occurred. And then you can talk about the people who work in the factory who are in charge of making the little springs and the machine that makes them and all the various causes and conditions. And the food that they ate that day when they worked, when they made this, all of the various things feed into this being here, this spring. The wooden pegs, they also obviously have a more substantial cause, which is the wood of the tree that they were taken from, or whatever, kind of um, wood that I don't know what kind of wood they make them from, whatever tree it was. And then, of course, the tree itself had its causes and conditions. It had all the sunlight and the nutrients in the soil and the rain and everything that contributed to its growth. And then you have the people who plant those trees, who harvest those trees so they can be cut up into the pegs, the people that work in the factory that make the pegs, what they ate for their meal that day that they did that, all the various things that contribute to this. You can find, in fact, infinite causes and conditions as to why this clothespin is here in my hand. So the question we end up with then is there a clothespin that exists independent of those causes and conditions? Of course, we come to the conclusion that no, there can't be, because without those causes and conditions, especially some of the most primary ones, we wouldn't have this in our hands. We wouldn't be able to use this to dry our clothes. All right. So that's the first level, and fairly easy to understand because we have a strong conviction in terms of cause and effect, especially with form, with physical forms in our world. We kind of get it because we know that if we don't pay attention to things physically, we get things going askew because we get different results than what we intend. So we do have some kind of honoring of cause and effect in our culture to some degree. The second level, in terms of dependence upon various factors or dependent arising, is its dependence upon parts. Once more, we could do an investigation where we could get down to infinite parts because they can take any one of these parts of a clothespin and do, look at it atomically and then subatomically and then, wherever they go after that, all the way down to quarks. And I don't know, again, in terms of, I don't study all that sort of stuff, but they have an ability with different microscopes to find all kinds of stuff going on in here down to, an infinitesimal degree. So if we, for the sake of our discussion, talk about three parts, because we can see that there are three main parts to this at a grosser level. We have what would be, the left peg, the right peg, and then the spring. So the question we can ask in terms of a clothespin is there a clothespin that exists independent of those parts? Well, no, because once more, the whole, what we call the clothespin, is always related to the parts. You can't have the whole without the parts. Now, with a clothespin, it's quite obvious because if I took one of these parts away, if I took this away, we would definitely see that there is no clothespin, what we call, wow, it's being stubborn today. Okay, what I have in my hand now, we wouldn't call that a clothespin, right? And if you went to the store and you bought a bag of these, you'd take them back, right? You'd say, I wanted a bag of clothespins. These aren't complete clothespins, or you'd call them something, but you wouldn't call it a clothespin because nobody's going to accept this as a clothespin. It doesn't serve that function. You can't use it on a clothesline. So we have, in this case, something that absolutely depends on its parts, because if you take any of those away, or if you took this spring away, and then you've just got these, you got a whole bag of these, well, you're really not in good shape, right? So, so this is showing that in this case, just removing one part, we no longer really have the object that we were talking about. But obviously, in the case of some things, like a body, for example, people come home from these, being on the battlefront of these horrible wars that are fought in the world, and they're missing a leg, or maybe two legs, or a leg and an arm, or whatever. We wouldn't say they don't have a body because they're missing a part of the body. So it's not to say that every phenomenon has the same level in terms of that dependence, but nonetheless, um, there is a point where you no longer have a body. If there are too many parts removed and you can't sustain that body, it doesn't serve the function of a body, well, then you no longer have it. So let's go to the third level, because we can see that there is no clothespin that exists independent of its causes and conditions, or independent of its parts. And to do this, what I want to do is I've got those three parts here, and I want to take each of them and examine them. So first of all, am I holding a clothespin in my hand now? Well, we just investigated and we saw that no, we wouldn't call this a clothespin. It doesn't, we might call it a part of a clothespin, but it's not a clothespin. Let's look at the middle part. Is there a clothespin in my hand now? No. And the final peg, is there a clothespin in my hand now? We'd say no for all three of those, right? But if I simply take this, and again, all I'm doing is reassembling it in terms of those three parts and putting them together in this way. Is there a clothespin in my hand now? Well, yes. I mean, and we're just talking on a conventional level. I'm not getting into the ultimate investigation as to whether there's a real clothespin in my hand. I'm just talking at the conventional level. We would all agree that there's a clothespin in my hand at this point. Well, where did it come from? If it wasn't in the first part, wasn't in the spring, wasn't in the last part, the peg, the other peg, where did it come from? So what the Buddha says in terms of the subtle level, this very subtle level of dependent arising, is that the clothespin doesn't come from any of these parts, nor from the collection of its parts. Rather, clothespin is a label, a designation that we give to this collection of parts. And of course, it has to be assembled this way for us to call it a clothespin. Somebody said once they used to, when I was showing them this, that they used to assemble this in some weird way so that you could make it into a little catapult and like fling paper balls at somebody or something. I don't know what they did. So so there's obviously different uses you could find for this, but for it to serve as clothespin and have the function of clothespin, it has to be assembled in this way. But when I assembled it, I didn't add anything. I didn't have like a fourth part that I added that was clothespin that made it clothespin. It's just that each of these parts cannot stand individually as clothespin, nor can the basis alone even stand as clothespin, because in the end, it also depends upon my designating it as clothespin. Of course, we can, to some degree, prove this because this could serve many other functions. If I took this to a culture that never had clothespins, and there probably are people on this planet that live somewhat remotely that would look at this and not know how to identify it, they might not use it in the same way, and they'd certainly give it some other name, but they would, find their own way to relate to this object that would not be as a clothespin. There was that interesting film. I sometimes use this as a good example of dependent arising and how things kind of lack anything more than what we label them as, is the film that was called The Gods Must Be Crazy, where there was the beginning part of it. It's not a great film, but the beginning part is kind of interesting. These two South African men are flying over the Kalahari Desert, and they're finishing up, one is finishing up a bottle of Coca-Cola, and he finishes it, and then he flings the bottle out the window, and the bottle goes sailing down, and it lands in this sand in the Kalahari Desert. And there's a bushman of the Kalahari that looks up, seeing this thing coming down from the sky, and it falls in front of him. And he's like, not sure what this is. And he goes over and he kind of pokes it with a stick, trying to figure out what this object is. And then eventually he picks it up and he starts, you know, looking at it and figuring out what to do with it. And he thinks it's a gift from the gods, because in their culture, the gods are up in the sky, and this is something that the gods have given him. And of course, it becomes a real valuable gift because he takes it back to his little tribe, and they use it to pound up grain, and they use it to smooth out snake skins, and they use it in a variety of ways. They even use it as a musical instrument by blowing into the top of the bottle. But people will, in the audience, in a Western context, they're all looking at it and going, oh, he's using this Coca-Cola bottle in all these ways. But it's not a Coca-Cola bottle for the Bushmen of the Kalahari. It has no identity as a Coca-Cola bottle. They have an identity of it as a gift from the gods. And this gift from the gods, unfortunately, where the movie goes from there is the gods only gave them one. So it shows how delusion arises when, we start getting attached to the one, and we want it for ourselves and want to make sure that, all of this is in our benefit. So nonetheless, this is what it is for the Bushmen. It's not a Coca-Cola bottle. We can see it from our point of view as that, but it has no validity as a Coca-Cola bottle from its own side, just as this object isn't a clothespin from its own side. Even a dog would relate to this quite differently. If I had a dog in the room, I'd throw it across the room, and it might start enjoying chewing on the wooden parts, have a hard time when it gets to the spring. But nonetheless, it would say, oh, good, a chew toy. Whatever a dog thinks. A dog doesn't use the word chew toy. But nonetheless, shows how this is really dependent upon my labeling it as clothespin. Now, again, I can't label anything clothespin. I can't take this and say this is a clothespin, because conventionally we haven't agreed that this is a clothespin. This is a highlighter, and it serves a different function. I use it in a much different way than I use the clothespin. But each of these objects is dependent upon my designating it through conventional agreement to be what it is. When I assembled it, you could see that clothespin was there and appeared to be there, but if we analyze, we see that there is nothing from any of the parts of the clothespin, nor from even the collection of the clothespin, that is a real clothespin, that kind of sets itself up as clothespin. This is kind of showing the two sides of it, that we say when we speak about those three levels of dependent arising, we are getting down to understanding how things actually exist, how form exists, how feeling exists, how you exist, how everything exists. Is that there is a basis for that object that is being identified, that phenomenon, and there is a label that is being given to that object. The basis has to serve the function of being a suitable basis, because as I said, we can't just give the label to anything. But once there is conventional agreement about these labels, then we are totally valid in saying this is a clothespin because that's how we conventionally identify it as. Don't identify again something else as being clothespin. This is a clothespin. This is what we've all agreed upon. So there is kind of a methodology for how things arise. It's just that what happens in terms of our minds from that point forward is where the errors come in. Because we don't stop at things being merely imputed, merely designated, merely labeled, whatever these different words are that we use for that process. Instead, what happens is as soon as we put the label, hear the label for what this clothespin is, which again is it's making it sound perhaps like it's language. Language is involved because we need language to communicate. I couldn't communicate with all of you if we didn't agree upon the meaning of certain words. But nonetheless, it can even be just at the level of concept that we can relate to this. But as soon as I put a conceptual label or some, you know, uh, verbalization of that in terms of words, terms, and so on, as soon as I put that on there, it's as if the label and the object, the basis, kind of become one. The basis and the label seem to merge into one. This is a very kind of a one of the most difficult things in terms of our realization of emptiness is because we have to recognize that how things then appear back to us, which is where both of those are mixed, the label and the basis being kind of one, it seems to exist on its own out here. It seems to have its own clothespin identity, its own clothespinness established out here from its own side. That's really what we're trying to negate is this false appearance that things have. Remember how I was talking about how there are two obstructions when we went through the path? One of those obstructions is the false appearance that is occurring as well as the imprints that cause that. And that's what we call, again, the knowledge obstructions. That's the subtler obstruction. The second obstruction, which was actually the first one I talked about on the path, because it's the first one you have to remove, is the ignorance and all the afflictions that are built on that that believe in that false appearance, that adhere to that false appearance. This seems to be real from its own side once it's been labeled, once I've designated it as clothespin. Clothespin, the label, and the object that's in my hand, which is the basis for clothespin. Those are two separate things. They merge as if they're one, and it seems to be established on its own out here in my hand as a clothespin. But that is a false appearance. And then we cling to that false appearance. We think that everything that exists, that it all appears this way, and therefore we cling to it as if it exists that way. So you have two things involved in the process. You have the mistaken conception that things inherently exist, which is based on seeing the appearance of things inherently existing. This is what we remove first on the path, is getting rid of our conception that things inherently exist. We do that through the wisdom realizing emptiness. It sees that things don't actually exist in the way that they appear. Then eventually the appearance falls away on those three pure grounds. Remember, on the bodhisattva path, on the path of meditation, you have that level where you start to remove what are called the knowledge obstructions. And this false appearance gets whittled away until eventually you no longer have any error, as it was said in that very end thing that we just touched on briefly. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach this end point of the complete nirvana, the Buddha nirvana, which is a state where you have removed all errors in the mind. So one analogy too that I use, but we'll go back to the text and open it up for questions as well, but one analogy that I also like to use is one that the Buddha gave, and I think we'll see it even in Tendar Larumpa's commentary, which is a dream. Most of us, I'm assuming your dreams are like mine because I don't know anyone's mind except my own, so I have to assume that your dreams are like mine. But when I dream, I have this, appearance of something, and because I don't have an awareness that it's just an appearance, I start buying into it, and I start having these emotional experiences in my dream. Sometimes desire will arise in a dream, sometimes anger or fear or all these various things arise in a dream, right? But we know when we wake up that how it appeared to exist is very different than how it actually exists, right? Because the dream objects don't exist in the way they appear. They appear to be real, but they're not real in that way. They are simply dream appearances. those dream appearances can serve a function in that they can cause my emotions to arise and so on, and have, my heart race and whatever is going on in my dream state. But they don't exist in the way they appear. They still are just mere appearances within the realm of my dream awareness, but they seem to be real. They appear to be real. So I use that as an analogy just to get at this idea that even in our waking life, things are appearing to be real, as if they're self-established, but they don't have that reality at all. And we can find that to be truth by using various reasonings to get at the wisdom that realizes the lack of that, the emptiness of that things don't exist on their own, independently, established from their own side. So this is the idea behind all of this that I'm sure I could say more, but I want to at least do a little teaching on emptiness to see if, before we get into these words, if we're going to talk about all these words, what does it mean to say form is empty, emptiness is form? Um, so at least some of the terminology and some of the ways of examining this. So let me open it up to see if there are any questions, and then we will go back to the text. Everyone's achieved some great realization of emptiness then.
Another,
Hi, Maria.
at least for me, aside from the dreams, is to when a rainbow appears.
Yeah.
So that is always makes me reflect on these three categories that you just mentioned: the parts, the causes and conditions, and then the mind labeling
Yeah.
rainbow.
Yeah.
And we always like try to like focus and like at least
Yeah.
like go through that, because as well it appears so
Yeah.
real
Yeah.
there, permanent, and it's none of that.
Yeah. A rainbow is a wonderful example. Actually, yeah, Tendar Larumpa, as you may have read if you read ahead a little bit, does talk about various things that can be used, a dream and so on. He doesn't mention a rainbow, but there are a variety of them that the Buddha taught that we can see if we examine these various features. And he even says in there, work with what works for you,
Yeah.
which I always am encouraging people to. I like dream because it works for me, but other people, can find other things, an echo, a mirage. A lot of things appear to be very different than how they actually exist. So, and thanks for that. Any other comments on that, or yeah, yes,
Yeah.
Andrea,
Hi, I'm back.
you're back.
Um,
Wonderful.
it may be like a separate discussion, but like I understand conceptually what you're speaking,
Uh-huh.
and it really makes sense. I just have a hard time when you transition that, and maybe we'll touch on this later, to the real life, to the day to day, when
Right.
something upsetting happens, and then you're like, okay, but it doesn't exist from its own side, but it's upsetting. Do you fight for it? Do you let it go? I think this is where the the practical application of the concept is where I get stuck.
Yeah. And that's a very good question, because in my estimation, realizing emptiness or having an awareness of emptiness when we are encountering different situations in life is a much harder task than some of the other antidotes that are taught in Buddhism. Like, for example, if someone is yelling at us, well, it might be easier to think about the disadvantages of anger. If I were to respond with anger to that person, I know where it goes. I know it's upsetting for me. I know I'm going to probably say something or do something that I regret. I mean, all those kinds of antidotes, those are hard to apply, but they're easier to apply than, oh, there's no inherently existent me, and that person is empty of inherent existence. They're like a dream, whatever. I mean, I think we have to have a pretty strong force of wisdom realizing emptiness before it can be that effective in overcoming this sense of, yeah, a real I, a real person, whatever, all that we tend to, exaggerate. But nonetheless, I think we should use it when we can. I mean, if there is an example like Maria's rainbow or whatever that we can kind of look at and just let loose a little bit of this sense of a target that we're setting up. Because once more, even though we're mostly, we're going into phenomena here, we're going into form and feelings and all these things that are not a person is where it all starts. As I said, realizing the emptiness of the I, the person, is the most important, because this is how we set up the target. This is how we set up the target that we get attracted to when we get pleasurable things in our life, the target that we are offended by when we have unpleasant things in our life that we want to push away. So if we can loosen up that sense of the target, of this strong sense of I in the space of that, that can be very effective. And I think with some meditation on emptiness, you can do that. seeing it all as empty. I mean, eventually we can get to that place. But I think, again, for most of us, we have to work with the kind of what they call the temporal antidotes, those things that we can apply on the basis of other reasoning. Like another reasoning for someone who's saying upsetting things to you is that we can see them as an object of compassion, actually, because they've got their own minds that are tormented at that time by their own delusions. I mean, that is also challenging to have compassion in the space of that. But once you kind of see them as a suffering person, you probably won't react in quite the same way, you know. So I would encourage most people to work at that level and then eventually apply emptiness or apply it when you can, but not feel like it's your go-to antidote because it's probably not so strong in the mind to be able to use it in that way.
Okay,
Okay.
I thank you. I like the concept of antidotes. I mean, if you have
Yeah.
a list or a formal
Yeah.
text, that you can look, that'll be
Well, what I
great.
can do is yeah, I'll send to Maria the one meditation that's in Discovering Buddhism on the various afflictions and their antidotes. It only has about 6 of the afflictions, but that's enough to work with for most of us in terms of, and it does talk about realizing emptiness in there as the antidote to ignorance and even as the antidote to some of the other ones, but that's what we call the ultimate antidote. The ultimate antidote that covers all of them is the wisdom realizing emptiness, because if we get that there's no real I and there's no real phenomena and whatever at that level that it's taught in terms of the emptiness teachings, then we have disempowered the whole process. And that can be done for any of the delusions. You can realize emptiness and have it work there. But temporal antidotes are usually more specific to each one. They kind of target each one in a very specific way. Um, so good, that's a good question, because I think the practical side is going to be hard for most of us. It's still hard for many people, even after years of studying emptiness. So, good.
I,
Yes, Francesca.
am I correct? I don't know that, this emptiness of the phenomena, it's, you explain it, and I don't think I can say that I understand 100%, but I'm familiar, I've thought about and meditated quite sometimes. Is it the Prasangika? Is it correct that says it also the conventional reality? So not only the object, but also the fact what we impute is empty. Is this and this for me, I don't know if is something that it's true or not, and it does not exist even the concept of
Well,
the
again,
clothing or molletta in Italian.
I mean, what we have to discern in here, and what we'll get into in a moment when we start looking at these various ways that we can establish emptiness, is that we never go to this extreme of saying things don't exist at all, certainly. But nonetheless, we do have to say that anything that exists is merely designated and therefore is empty of any inherent nature, any independent nature. So even emptiness and all the labels we give, which, by the way, the label clothespin, which we put on this, and this base are two different phenomena, because if they were the same phenomenon, then they would be inherently existent. So we're putting a label of clothespin on this collection of stuff that we refer to as clothespin. But as we saw, there's no clothespin on this basis. There's nothing that establishes it as clothespin from its own side. It doesn't exist independent of my mind as clothespin. So the label certainly is lacking inherent existence too. It is empty. It has no substantial existence from its own side. It is merely designated. And the base is merely designated. Even any of these parts that I choose, if I choose just the one peg and work with it, it's also, we designate this as clothespin peg, or peg of a clothespin. It doesn't have any existence from its own side. It's merely labeled. This that's in my hand is the basis for that labeling. So it too lacks inherent existence. And then if we talk about the beveled groove here on this clothespin, just that beveled groove is also merely imputed, is also lacking inherent existence, because these two go hand in hand. The way things exist are always in terms of their conventional nature and their ultimate nature. You cannot have a conventional phenomenon existing without its ultimate nature. In fact, this is what we mean by the passage that we're going to go into momentarily. Form is empty, emptiness is form, means that you cannot establish them as two separate things. Oh, here's its emptiness over here, here's the form over here. They are arising together and are inextricably woven up in everything that exists. Its conventional nature, which is how it is designated through the force of conventional agreement to call things what they are in terms of our ability to relate to them. And then its ultimate nature, which is the fact that it doesn't exist from its own side or independent of that labeling or of causes and conditions or of parts, all the various ways. So those two things are existing in tandem. You can't have one without the other. And it's only through emptiness that form arises. And whenever you have form established, then you have its emptiness there, because it's only from that process of things not existing inherently that anything exists, that anything arises. So yes, any phenomenon you choose, even emptiness itself, is a mere designation, a mere imputation, and it therefore lacks any independent or inherent existence.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's go to those words. Okay, again, in the text it said form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. So what I want to talk about in regard to those, I'll go to some slides here now that relate to this. Share there. So we did this one in terms of the 5 aggregates. I went through these 5 paths, so I don't need to do that again. I talked about the 3 levels of dependent arising. Again, this will be in your slides if you need to refer to it, the slides you'll receive from Maria. I didn't point this out here, but in regard to those first 2 levels, I'm sorry, the first level. The first level pertains only to compounded or created phenomena, while the second and third are established for all phenomena. Why I have to say that is because emptiness, for example, emptiness, we could say depends upon its parts, because you can talk about the emptiness of this moment, next moment, so on, temporal parts. But emptiness also depends upon mere imputation. But emptiness doesn't have causes and conditions. The clothespin that is empty, or the person that is empty, has causes and conditions. But emptiness itself has no causes and conditions. It's not a caused phenomenon. It doesn't arise in that way. It is a negation. So again, the clothespin that I'm holding, that clothespin, we say definitely has causes and conditions that led to its being here. But the emptiness of clothespin is a static phenomenon that doesn't change moment by moment. It's the emptiness, at this point, at the next point. It has parts in terms of the timing of that. As long as clothespin exists, the emptiness of clothespin exists. But it isn't created. It doesn't arise from causes and conditions, whereas the stuff I have in my hand does have causes and conditions. So anyway, just something I wanted to make sure I point out before we continue on. So this gets into, when we talk about this idea of form is empty, emptiness is form, gets into these 2 truths. These 2 truths that we are presented by the different schools. Again, that one book that I had Maria send the title out to you talks about how the 2 truths are presented in different schools. According to Prasangika Madhyamaka, this consequence middle way school, and these are my words. This isn't like a formal definition. This is just my words used, to kind of talk about this. Conventional truth, in the end, when we come to understand it in its full form, refers to how all phenomena arise in dependence on various factors, the most subtle of which is their dependence upon mere imputation. So when we talk about dependent arising, we're mostly talking about the conventional nature of things, their conventional truth. Right now, most beings that are together with ignorance, ourselves included to some degree, though we're developing our minds in that direction, think that conventional truth is so much more than that. Through the force of our ignorance, we think that things exist independently. So our false view of conventional truths is operative, but how we come to understand conventional truth by realizing dependent arising and emptiness is this fact that is on the screen, that all phenomena arise in dependence on various factors. That is how everything exists conventionally, as I was just saying in answer to Francesco's question. Ultimate truth refers to how all phenomena lack any independent, inherent, or intrinsic existence. Again, in the traditional texts, they set out all these various things that are hypothetical synonyms to this. They can't say they're real synonyms because this doesn't exist. Independent existence doesn't exist. Inherent existence doesn't exist. All phenomena lack that. They also lack existing from their own side, existing by way of their own characteristics, existing substantially, objectively. All these phrases that mean the object of negation, what it is that we are believing in because things appear that way. They have that false appearance, like I was explaining, and we grasp at that. We think that that's real. Ultimate truth is the realization of emptiness. It refers to emptiness. I could have just put emptiness in there, but I wanted to just describe it. All phenomena lack any of these false ways of existing. So let's go on to the next slide where we look at this form is empty, emptiness is form. And we can see that this first statement, this first statement is referring to the ultimate nature of form. That is, its emptiness of inherent existence. When we say form is empty, we are meaning this phenomenon we call form, which in this case is referring to the personal aggregates that you possess, which would be your body, everything that we consider part of our body, which is all the material stuff that is sitting on your chair right now. All of that is empty. Its ultimate nature is lacking any inherent existence. But then when we go in number 2 and say emptiness is form, it refers to the subtle conventional nature of form, that it is a manifestation of emptiness, that within the sphere of things not existing inherently, things arise. Things come into existence, those things that are created or compounded arise from their causes and conditions. They depend upon those. So emptiness is form. These two truths are inexplicably bound up through the first two things that we look at. We already are getting that feeling that it's form that is being posited as empty within the emptiness of form that has to be posited together with the form. By the way, these aren't referring to emptiness as some sort of um, general phenomenon. This is really talking about the emptiness of form, as it was said in the first one. Form is empty, meaning that form lacks any inherent existence. It has its own emptiness. That emptiness that we're talking about is form. Not that they're equivalent, but that it's only within the sphere of emptiness that form even can arise. That the subtle way that form exists as a dependent arising, particularly, again, having dependence upon mere imputation, mere designation, that is what we mean by emptiness, is there can't be anything more than nominal existence. Nominal existence is, in the end, the only way that things exist. So emptiness as form once more speaks to that idea that we cannot have any form arising without it arising from emptiness, from a lack of inherent existence. And then finally, we have emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. Those two facts, these two qualities, that refers to the two truths being the same entity, but what are called different isolates. So let me explain this. And same entity means that, once more, they're inexplicably bound up. You don't have form over here and emptiness over there, or emptiness of form over there as two separate things. Instead, they are conceptually identified by one looking at its conventional nature, that it arises in dependence upon various factors and is what we call form. That's its conventional nature. And then we look at the other side and we see that it has an ultimate nature of lacking anything more than that nominal existence. Anything that's more substantial than that is denied. Anything that is inherently there, existing from its own side, doesn't exist at all. So these two truths about any phenomenon, that's why, again, we could extend this to say feeling is empty. Emptiness is feeling. Emptiness is not other than feeling. Feeling is also not other than emptiness. Because any phenomenon we choose, we see that those two indicate the sum total of any phenomenon. It has its conventional mode of existence, its conventional truth, being merely designated as such, and it has its ultimate nature, which is its emptiness of inherent existence. So this is what this first statement, which again is one of the most popular statements from the Heart Sutra, obviously, that really gets at this, the heart of what we mean in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, that these two truths are posited with regard to everything that exists. And once more, once you go, okay, you have form and emptiness of form, well, then we can also say, using the emptiness of form, it has a conventional existence and an ultimate existence, the emptiness of form, and so on. You never find anything in this whole process that is able to stand on its own, that is able to be completely independent. Everything instead is completely dependent. It is dependent upon, again, if it's produced, causes and conditions. If it is not produced or produced, all phenomena, they depend upon their parts, and they depend upon being merely labeled or merely designated. So let's go through one more slide that shows kind of, well, maybe this one will wait because that gets into our commentary. Let's stop the share screen and see where everybody's at. Should we go back to the text? Are we ready to do that? I think so. Okay. So we are in this section. This is actually where we left off last time. So although I haven't taught much from the text, I think from here on out it'll be relatively easy to go through because we have some agreement about what we mean by this. So I'm at the place, it's about 7, 8 lines down in How Avalokiteshvara Answered on page 13, where he uses the phrase empty of inherent existence that he's taking from the sutra. Tendarla Rumpa says that means empty from its own side. Therefore, it means that phenomena are not established objectively or from the side of the object. For example, when a house appears in a dream, it does not appear from the side of a basis appearing toward the subject, but rather is projected out from the side of the perceiving consciousness. There is an appearance. But he says, therefore, it must be understood that the conventional status of phenomena is just like that we're always dealing with kind of an appearance that is simply being established on whatever basis, seeming to be real, as things do appear in our dream to appear to be real. According to the Prasangikas, it says, inherent establishment, being kind of existing on their own, out there, self-established, completely independent, that is the object of negation, of reasonings analyzing the ultimate. So this is all the reasonings that we do in this school of thought, such as the 4-point reasoning, which many of you know. We might talk about that at a later point. The diamond slivers, which is a reasoning where you go in and analyze how are things produced. Can they possibly be produced inherently, either inherently from themselves, from others, from something that is both, something that is neither. There's all these different reasonings that the Buddha taught for people of different predispositions. And the whole purpose of all those reasonings, dependent arising as a reasoning, is to get us to realize emptiness, is to get us to realize the lack of inherent existence, that things can't possibly have that mode of existence because it totally would deny their mere existence. Things cannot arise without emptiness. It's only through emptiness that everything is possible, as Nagarjuna says. So he says there, hence, this is a weird phrase because Ageshe Tempo in his commentary points this out, where it says, hence, even though the qualification ultimate is not affixed explicitly to the object of negation, it is affixed implicitly. He says, well, Prasangika wouldn't need to do that because when we say things don't exist inherently, that is a denial of their ultimate existence. We don't need to say ultimately things don't exist inherently because it would be like repeating it. So he doesn't feel that this sentence really makes a lot of sense. The other school of the middle way would need to do that because they don't think that inherent existence exists ultimately, but they do hold it to exist conventionally. Now, I'm not going to go there because that gets to be a really complicated explanation, kind of goes beyond the scope of what we're looking at here. But what we're talking about here again, though, is that when we do ultimate analysis in the Prasangika, we are looking at how do things exist at the deepest level. If we're just doing conventional analysis, well, this is what we do in our world all the time, right? Is there a cup on the table? We go, well, yeah, there's a cup. You point to the cup. That's fine. But then if someone says in a more philosophical tone, you go to the other type of reasoning, well, but then how does this cup exist? How does it exist when I examine whether there is a self-established cup, whether cup exists from the side of this stuff that I'm holding in my hand? And of course, that ultimate analysis leads to an investigation of emptiness, leads us to the conclusion of emptiness. So, nonetheless, I guess I don't know exactly how to explain completely why that sentence is in there about ultimate, but the last part of it there before we get to him quoting this bit of the sutra, he says, therefore, it is of definitive meaning, nitartha, and is literal. So again, he's saying that this sutra, and especially that statement that we're going to be talking about, where he's saying that things don't exist inherently, he's saying form is empty, emptiness is form, all of this, it's meant to be taken really quite literally. Now, again, we can't say literal means that we don't still need some level of meaning involved. Like when we get to the place where we say, there are, in emptiness, there is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue. I mean, all of those are qualified as no inherently existent eye, ear. If we said mere eye, merely labeled eye, obviously that exists. So anyway, we'll get into that when we get to those, but nonetheless, this sutra is for prasangika madhyamaka of definitive meaning, meaning that this is meant to be taken as it's stated, that this is what the Buddha is saying, that there is no inherent existence. Because again, that was that last little part about holding the five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. And then when we get into this part, where it says there at the bottom of 13, when form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is not other than emptiness is understood in a coarse way, according to the Chittamatrans. Remember, those are the mind-only people. It means this appearance of form is one's own mind, which is empty of the duality of subject and object. One's own mind is the appearance of form. One's own mind is not other than the appearance of form. The appearance of form is also not other than one's own mind. So that's how Chittamatra would read this. So that's not how we read it. We're going to get to how Prasangika reads it. Chittamatra, again, holds this. When I talked about selflessness of phenomena in particular, I was talking about the mind-only view a few sessions ago, maybe even in our first session. But what they believe and what they're holding on the basis of a sutra that the Buddha taught. But this was a provisional sutra. This wasn't a definitive sutra. This is one that needs interpretation. And it was one that the Buddha was giving for the sake of those trainees who could use a teaching like this to help let go of their attachment to external objects. So what they say in Mind Only is that this cup that is appearing, to my mind, even to your minds there, it is arising from a karmic imprint, what they call in Tibetan a bakchak, on my mind that gives rise to a dual thing, a subjective awareness, seeing and knowing this cup, and the cup itself appearing. In their view, there is no real external form. In other words, our reality is not really just like a dream, it's pretty much a dream. It's like in dream states where obviously we have things appearing in dream states to us. When we wake up, they're gone. All those things we were dreaming, they're not, there's no real basis for them. They take some of the Buddha's teachings around dream states and so on to hold that our external reality, all the things that we see in our world are, conventionally we can see that they're arising from causes and conditions, but everything involved in them is arising from an imprint on our own minds, a karmic disposition that gives rise to this appearance as if it is external to the mind, but it actually is an internal thing that is arising in conjunction with the subjective awareness knowing it. Chittamatrin's not for everybody, obviously, but for those people who have a strong attachment to outside forms, who, are clinging to them, well, if they think that this external form doesn't exist in the way that it appears as it's external to my mind, if it's just arising from a karmic seed on my mind, well, then that may loosen up some of their attachment. So again, Prasangika's view of emptiness has its own challenges in applying it to our everyday life. But this could be a way that the Buddha was skillfully teaching those who had some inclination to this type of teaching to begin to let go of that strong attachment to things. So everything that I just read was a Chittamatran way of saying what the Heart Sutra means, because they will interpret the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, in a different way. They hold it to be interpretive, whereas we hold it to be definitive. We say, no, they really mean this, that things don't have inherent nature. Not that they don't have any external existence in the way that they appear, but rather that they have no inherent nature. Because Prasangika doesn't have a problem saying there's an external cup. Saying, okay, here we can even see, again, all the causes and conditions that led to this. They just say the cup doesn't exist in this other way that it appears, as if it's self-established, as if it exists out here on this basis. So that's the meaning of it. What we'll do in the next class, because we're already at 1:30, is briefly discuss this prasangika interpretation of this, which I already did talk about to some degree. And then we'll, of course, also relate this to the extremes to make sure that we understand, too, how this statement, these various statements are helping us not to fall to either extreme. Again, not to negate that things exist at all, not to hold them to exist in this more concrete, independent way. So I realize I spent more time today talking about emptiness than going through the text, but it's really quite essential to spend some time, and this is the whole purpose of this text, the whole meaning of this text in terms of its explicit meaning, is to give us some clues as to how to discern emptiness, how to develop that wisdom. Whereas, again, the implicit meaning that we're getting, as we see on the chart even, that is to how to follow that wisdom realizing emptiness through these paths, to develop it so that we can accomplish the bodhisattva path. So any final questions for today? No? I've kind of done my work then, I guess. I don't know. All right. So let's do just some closing dedication to wrap up today. So think very strongly that through the force of what we've done this last hour and a half, all the wonderful seeds that we planted in our minds by examining the Buddha's teachings, by looking at this very profound view of emptiness that is taught, may this bring forth the greatest possible results. May we be able to realize emptiness directly, remove all of our own obscurations so that we can then help others to do the same, having attained that state of full enlightenment. We also dedicate for the good health and long lives of all of our amazing teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Kyabje Zopa Rinpoche, the head of the FPMT, as well as all the other teachers that we and others have karmic connections with in whatever traditions. May all these guides have good health and long lives, and may we and others always have perfect guides that are teaching us, that are directing us. And then lastly, if you want to dedicate for anyone who you're holding in your heart, you can do that now personally, just sending this positive energy that you've created out to those who you know or whose situation moves you, people who have obstacles to their well-being right now, people who are dealing with great illness, other forms of suffering, people who have died recently, and so on. So wherever it is in the world, or whoever it is that you're holding in your heart, just send this energy out to them and think it becomes the cause to alleviate their suffering and to bring them everything that they need, all the perfect conditions to become enlightened quickly. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through what we've done here today. Okay, thank you all so much. I enjoyed it very much. Take care.